The day a blind girl slapped me. Every man who worked for me expected someone to disappear. They were all wrong. I had spent 15 years building a reputation that entered every room before I did. People lowered their voices when my convoy stopped outside a building. Business owners straightened their ties before shaking my hand. Rivals smiled with their mouths while measuring every word. Fear was predictable. Respect was negotiable. Silence was guaranteed. That rainy Thursday evening in downtown Boston, I stepped out of my black SUV wearing a tailored charcoal suit that still smelled faintly of cedar from my closet. My driver opened the umbrella, but I waved him away. I liked the rain. It drowned unnecessary conversations. It blurred the edges of the city and reminded me that even concrete could be washed clean for a few minutes. The sidewalk outside the community arts center was crowded with people escaping the weather. Someone laughed. A bus hissed to a stop. Coffee drifted from a nearby cafe. My security team spread out without a word, creating the invisible circle they always did. Then everything changed because of one small accident. A young woman stepped backward from the entrance, holding a white cane folded against her coat. She turned suddenly as if trying to avoid another pedestrian. Her shoulder bumped into my chest. She gasped, startled by the unexpected contact, and before I could say a single word, her open hand struck my cheek with a sharp crack that seemed louder than the rain itself. Every sound around us vanished. My men froze. The pedestrians stopped walking. Even the traffic seemed to hesitate. I slowly turned my head back toward her, more surprised than angry. She stood perfectly still, her breathing uneven, her hand trembling slightly in the cold air. Her pale blue eyes looked directly toward me, yet somehow through me, unfocused in a way that made something inside my mind pause. She wasn't looking at me. She couldn't. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice shaking. Someone grabbed my arm before, I thought. She stopped speaking and lowered her hand, searching the empty space between us with uncertain movements until the white cane slipped from her fingers onto the wet sidewalk. One of my guards stepped forward immediately. Boss, just give the order. Another reached for his earpiece, already anticipating instructions that had followed countless insults over the years. I didn't answer. Instead, I kept watching her kneel carefully, feeling the pavement with both hands until she found the cane. She apologized again, not knowing who stood in front of her, not knowing that dozens of people in this city avoided saying my name above a whisper. She wasn't fearless. She was simply living in a world where appearances held no power. For the first time in years, someone had touched my pride without ever intending to. My cheek barely stung anymore, but something much deeper had been disturbed. My men waited. The rain continued to fall. The city held its breath. I looked at the woman who had unknowingly done what no rival, politician, or billionaire had ever managed to do. Then I smiled. That frightened my men far more than if I had shouted. Find out who she is, I said quietly. No one follows her too closely. No one scares her. And no one tells her my name. My head of security frowned. Sir, what exactly are we doing? I watched the blind girl disappear slowly into the rain, tapping her cane across the sidewalk with quiet determination. I'm going to teach her a lesson, I answered. I just have a feeling. I won't be the one learning it. I had learned long ago that patience unsettled people more than anger ever could. Anger was expected. Patience forced them to imagine what came next. My convoy rolled through the wet streets while the windshield gathered endless beads of rain that stretched the city lights into ribbons of gold and white. No one inside the SUV spoke. My security team kept stealing quick glances toward me through the rearview mirror, waiting for instructions that never came. Finally, Anthony cleared his throat. He had been with me for almost 12 years, long enough to recognize when silence meant calculation instead of forgiveness. We have her name, he said carefully. I looked out the window before answering. Tell me. Grace Carter, 26 years old, lives alone in a small apartment in Back Bay. Volunteers 3 afternoons a week at the Community Arts Center. Teaches piano lessons to children on weekends. No criminal record. No lawsuits. No debt worth mentioning. I remained quiet. Anthony continued reading from the tablet in his hands. She lost her eyesight 6 years ago after helping evacuate children during a warehouse fire. Doctors said there was nothing they could do. His voice became softer without realizing it. Everyone around the neighborhood speaks highly of her. I looked away from the rain for the first time. Who takes care of her? He blinked. No one, sir. She takes care of herself. That answer stayed with me much longer than I expected. The next morning, I canceled 2 meetings worth several $1,000,000. My executive assistant stared at me as though I had forgotten my own name. I simply told her something more important had come up. By noon, I stood across the street from the community arts center wearing an ordinary navy coat instead of an Italian suit. No security beside me. No convoy waiting at the curb. Just another man holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Grace emerged exactly at 12:15, her folded white cane tapping lightly against the sidewalk before unfolding with practiced confidence. She smiled at nearly everyone she passed. An elderly man carrying groceries. A mother pushing a stroller. 2 teenagers arguing over whose turn it was to carry a guitar case. Somehow she recognized people by their footsteps, their voices, or perhaps something I could not understand. Then she reached the corner where a construction crew had left temporary barriers after repairing a water line overnight. One orange sign had tipped onto its side, blocking the safest path. Half a dozen people walked around it without stopping. Grace continued forward, completely unaware. My feet moved before my mind gave permission. "Careful," I said, stepping closer. She stopped immediately. "There is a barrier 3 feet ahead." She smiled toward the sound of my voice. "Thank you. I guess the city keeps changing without asking me first." I almost laughed. Almost. It usually does. She tilted her head slightly. "Your voice sounds familiar." My heartbeat slowed for reasons I could not explain. "We met yesterday." Her expression changed instantly. "The man from the sidewalk." She lowered her head. "I have been thinking about that all night. I am truly sorry." Every plan I had imagined during the drive there suddenly felt childish. She was apologizing to someone she had never seen and never would. There was no fear in her voice. Only sincerity. For the first time in years, revenge no longer sounded like justice. It sounded like an excuse. Grace stood quietly beside the construction barrier, waiting with the kind of patience that only came from rebuilding an entire life around uncertainty. I had negotiated with governors, argued with billionaires, and stared down men who believed money solved everything. Yet somehow I found myself searching for the right words in front of a woman who could not even see my face. "Would you allow me to walk you across the street?" I asked. She smiled politely. "Only if you promise not to treat me like I am fragile." I nodded before realizing she could not see the gesture. "I can promise that." She laughed softly. "Most people cannot." We crossed together, not because she needed someone to guide every step, but because she accepted that everyone occasionally needed another person to point out what they could not see. That thought lingered long after we reached the opposite sidewalk. "Thank you," she said. "You have already helped me twice. Perhaps I am making up for yesterday." Her smile grew warmer. "I think you already have." She adjusted the strap of a worn canvas bag resting on her shoulder. The corners were faded, and one handle had clearly been stitched by hand. Nothing about her suggested wealth or comfort, yet nothing suggested defeat either. She carried herself with quiet confidence that no expensive suit could imitate. "Do you teach here every day?" I asked. "Piano on weekdays. Reading classes on Tuesdays. Life skills on Thursdays. Whatever they need." "That sounds like a full schedule. Keeping busy is easier than feeling sorry for yourself." She said it so casually that I almost missed the weight behind the sentence. Before I could answer, a little boy ran through the front doors of the center. "Miss Grace," he shouted. "I learned the whole song." She immediately turned toward his voice, kneeling until they were almost eye level. "Did you really?" Without looking at the sheet music. She smiled. "Then you are already becoming a better musician than I ever was." The boy giggled before taking her hand and leading her toward the entrance with complete trust. She followed without hesitation, not because she could see the doorway, but because she believed the child would never let her stumble. I stood there longer than I intended, watching something I had almost forgotten existed. Pure trust. Anthony's voice interrupted through the discreet earpiece hidden beneath my collar. "Sir, we have been trying to reach you for 20 minutes. The board members are waiting." I pressed the device once. "Reschedule." There was a long silence before he answered. Again. I removed the earpiece entirely and slipped it into my pocket. For years my days had been measured in contracts, meetings, and numbers that stretched into the millions. Grace measured hers in piano lessons, careful footsteps, and children celebrating songs they had finally learned to play. Somehow her world felt larger than mine. As I turned toward my car, I noticed an elderly woman struggling with several grocery bags near the curb. Before I could react, Grace emerged from the building again, recognizing the woman's voice from half a block away. She walked over with practiced confidence and lifted 2 of the bags without being asked. The older woman thanked her 3 different times. Grace simply smiled and replied, "We all borrow strength from someone sooner or later." I remained perfectly still as those words settled somewhere deeper than I wanted to admit. For years I believed power meant making people depend on me. Grace believed strength meant reminding people they did not have to carry everything alone. I had planned to teach her a lesson about crossing the wrong man. Instead, every hour I spent near her made me question whether I had spent my entire life learning the wrong lessons. The following afternoon, I returned to the community arts center with a purpose I refused to admit even to myself. I told Anthony I wanted to understand the woman who had turned my carefully planned revenge into unanswered questions. He did not argue. He simply looked at me with the same expression a man wears when he realizes the map he has trusted for years no longer matches the road ahead. This time I did not wait across the street. I walked inside. The building smelled of fresh coffee, old books, and polished wood. Children's laughter drifted through the hallway like music that did not belong in the world I had spent my life creating. A volunteer greeted me with an easy smile and asked whether I was there to donate. I almost laughed. People usually asked whether I wanted to buy, acquire, or control something. No one had asked me to simply help in a very long time. I made a contribution large enough to cover several months of operating expenses, but I requested that my name remain private. The director thanked me repeatedly. I only asked one question. "May I observe the afternoon class?" He pointed toward the music room. Grace sat at an upright piano with 6 children gathered around her. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, warming the old wooden floor. She rested her fingertips lightly on the keys before playing a simple melody. The children copied each note with tiny keyboards placed on folding tables. Every mistake became another reason for her to encourage them instead of correcting them. "Listen before you play," she said softly. "Music begins with listening." Those words reached me more deeply than she could have imagined. I had spent years making sure everyone listened to me. I had forgotten how rarely I listened to anyone else. One little girl frowned after missing several notes. "I cannot do it," she whispered. Grace smiled without hesitation. "You cannot do it yet. Those are 2 different sentences." The room relaxed immediately. Even I felt my shoulders loosen. When the lesson ended, the children hurried toward the hallway, filling the room with excited conversations. Grace remained behind, carefully organizing the sheet music by touch. One folder slipped from the piano bench, scattering pages across the floor. Without thinking, I stepped forward and gathered them before she could kneel. "Thank you," she said with a familiar smile. "I recognize your footsteps now." I paused. "You can do that. Everyone leaves a different rhythm behind." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Yours are always measured, almost as if you are counting every step before you take it." No board member, politician, or rival had ever described me so accurately. They watched my face. She listened to my silence. I handed her the music. Our fingers brushed for only a moment, yet she immediately laughed. "You are frowning again. How could you possibly know that?" "Because whenever you are thinking too hard, you stop breathing for just a second." I stood there speechless. She had uncovered a habit none of my closest associates had ever noticed. "Life is difficult enough," she continued while placing the folders back on the shelf. "You do not have to carry every answer by yourself." She believed she was comforting an ordinary stranger. She had no idea she was speaking to a man whose entire life had been built on convincing the world that he never needed anyone. As I left the room, I realized something deeply unsettling. Every conversation with Grace left me feeling less certain about who I had become and strangely hopeful about the man I still might be. For the first time in years, I went home carrying questions instead of victories. My penthouse overlooked the Boston skyline, every window reflecting success that had taken decades to build. Marble floors, quiet hallways, paintings worth more than most houses. Yet the place had never felt emptier. I loosened my tie, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and stared through the glass as rain drifted across the harbor. Anthony arrived exactly at 7 the next morning carrying a thin folder. He placed it on my desk without speaking. He already knew I would read every page. Inside were newspaper articles, medical records that had become public after charity events, and interviews with firefighters who still remembered Grace Carter. 6 years earlier, an electrical fire had spread through an old warehouse that had been converted into an after-school program. The evacuation had become chaotic when smoke filled the stairwell. Several adults rushed outside believing everyone had escaped. Grace had heard a little girl crying from the second floor. She went back inside without hesitation. By the time firefighters reached them, she had carried the child to a window where both were safely rescued. The little girl survived without lasting injuries. Grace did not. The damage to her eyesight became permanent. I read the same article twice before setting it down. There was no interview where she complained. No statement asking for sympathy. Every reporter who had tried to praise her received the same answer. Anyone would have done the same. I knew that was not true. Most people hoped someone else would act first. Grace had never waited for someone else. Anthony broke the silence. There is something else. He handed me another page. It listed several organizations that had offered financial assistance after the accident. Every large donation had been politely declined except for medical expenses. She had accepted only what she needed to survive. Nothing more. Why? I asked quietly. Anthony shrugged. According to her neighbors, she says gratitude should never become dependence. I leaned back in my chair, remembering the worn canvas bag, the carefully repaired handle, the piano keys beneath her fingertips, and the way she thanked every person who opened a door, even though she had spent years opening doors for everyone else. That afternoon, I returned to the Arts Center carrying an envelope containing enough money to replace every instrument in the building. I intended to leave it anonymously. Before I reached the office, I heard familiar laughter coming from the courtyard. Grace sat beneath a maple tree helping two children identify flowers by touch. "Feel the edges," she told them gently. "Every leaf has its own shape, just like every person has a different story." One little boy asked, "Miss Grace, do you ever wish you could see again?" My footsteps stopped. Even the breeze seemed to pause. She smiled toward the warmth of the afternoon sun. "Of course I do. I miss sunsets. I miss my mother's face. I miss reading books without running my fingers across every page. But if I spend every day wishing for what I lost, I might miss everything I still have." Neither child spoke for several seconds. Neither did I. Slowly, I looked down at the envelope in my hand. For the first time in my life, money felt strangely small. It could renovate buildings, purchase influence, and solve countless practical problems, but it could not buy the quiet strength sitting beneath that maple tree. I slipped the envelope back inside my coat without leaving it behind because I suddenly understood that if I truly wanted to help Grace, I first needed to understand the difference between generosity and control. Until that moment, I had mistaken them for the same thing. The following week, I tried something I had never attempted before. I stopped arranging every moment before it happened. Instead of sending people ahead, instead of having every location inspected, I simply arrived at the community arts center without warning. It felt strangely unfamiliar to walk through the front door, carrying nothing but my own thoughts. Grace recognized my footsteps before I spoke. "You came back," she said with a quiet smile, while wiping the piano keys with a soft cloth. "I suppose I did. Most strangers only help once. Maybe I am not a stranger anymore." She laughed gently. "That depends. You still have not told me your name." I hesitated for a second that felt much longer. The truth would change everything, and I was not ready for that. "Vincent," I answered. It was the first completely honest thing I had said to her. "Well, Vincent, would you mind helping me move these music books to the next room?" I carried the heavy boxes while she walked beside me with practiced confidence, lightly tracing the hallway wall with her fingertips. She never asked anyone to do what she could accomplish herself. When we reached the classroom, she carefully arranged each book according to the raised labels she had placed on every shelf. Everything had its own system. Everything had a purpose. "You organize all of this by yourself?" I asked. "It saves everyone else time. You could ask for more help." She smiled as though she had heard that sentence hundreds of times before. People deserve the chance to help because they choose to, not because I expect it. Before I could respond, the center director hurried into the room holding a stack of unopened envelopes. His face looked troubled. "Grace, I hate bringing this up again, but the roof repairs cannot wait any longer. We have enough money for another month, maybe two if we postpone replacing the heating system." Grace listened quietly before answering. "Then we will hold another fundraiser." We already held 3 this year. Then we will hold a 4th. There was no frustration in her voice, only determination. The director sighed and walked away to answer a ringing telephone. I looked around the room more carefully than I had before. Several chairs had been repaired instead of replaced. One piano pedal had clearly been welded back together. The paint near the windows had begun to peel. They were accomplishing extraordinary work with ordinary resources. My first instinct was simple. Write one check. Solve every problem before dinner. Yet I remembered the envelope still sitting untouched inside my desk drawer at home. Grace had already taught me that giving without understanding often became another form of control. Can I ask you something? I said. She nodded. Why do you never ask wealthy people to rescue this place? She rested both hands on the back of a wooden chair before answering. Because if one generous person saves us today, we might forget how strong an entire community can become tomorrow. Her words settled over the room with remarkable calm. People value what they build together. I looked through the window where parents were arriving to pick up their children. Some carried toolboxes because they volunteered to repair broken shelves after work. Others brought homemade meals for the staff. One older man quietly replaced a burned-out light bulb before anyone even noticed it needed changing. No one expected applause. They simply showed up. Grace had built something far greater than a charity. She had built a place where kindness spread from one person to another without anyone keeping score. Standing there among the worn instruments and repaired furniture, I realized I had spent years believing loyalty could be purchased. Grace had quietly proven that the strongest loyalty was earned one act of kindness at a time. By the end of the second week, I no longer needed an excuse to visit the community arts center. My calendar still filled with meetings, negotiations, and responsibilities that demanded my attention, yet somehow I always found an hour that belonged only to Grace. Anthony noticed the pattern before I admitted it to myself. You smile more now, he said one morning while handing me a folder. I looked up from the reports. I smile. He nodded without hesitation. Not often, but enough that people have started talking about it. I almost dismissed the comment, but later that afternoon I caught my own reflection in the elevator doors. The man staring back at me looked exactly the same. The tailored suit, the polished shoes, the calm expression. Yet something behind my eyes had softened in a way I had never intended. When I arrived at the center, I found Grace sitting alone in the music room. She was running her fingertips across a stack of handwritten sheet music, smiling as though each page carried the voice of an old friend. You sound tired today, she said before I even greeted her. Do I? Your footsteps are heavier than usual. I laughed quietly. I had a long morning. She tilted her head. Then you should sit down for a minute instead of pretending you are made of steel. I pulled out the chair beside the piano and did exactly that. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable instead of awkward. Finally, she rested her hands on the keys and began playing a slow melody that filled the room with gentle warmth. I closed my eyes without thinking. The music carried no performance, no ambition, no desire to impress anyone. It simply existed because beauty deserved to exist. When the final note faded, I realized I had forgotten every unfinished problem waiting back at my office. What is that song called? I asked. She smiled. It does not have a name yet. Why not? Because some things should be lived before they are named. I repeated those words silently, wondering how many parts of my own life had been named long before I had ever truly lived them. A knock at the open door interrupted us. An elderly janitor stepped inside, holding a toolbox. Miss Grace, the railing by the front steps is loose again. I can fix it before dinner. She thanked him with genuine warmth. 10 minutes later, 2 parents arrived, carrying fresh paint for the hallway walls. A retired teacher dropped off donated books. A college student volunteered to tutor children preparing for exams. No one was asked. No one expected recognition. They simply came because Grace had inspired them to believe that small acts mattered. Watching them, I understood something I had overlooked for years. Influence built on fear disappeared the moment fear disappeared. Influence built on kindness multiplied every time it was shared. As the afternoon faded into evening, Grace gathered her things and reached for her folded cane. Walk with me, she asked. We stepped outside together beneath a sky painted in soft shades of orange and blue. The air smelled of fresh rain and blooming flowers from the nearby public garden. She turned her face toward the breeze and smiled. People think losing sight means living in darkness, she said quietly. They forget there are many ways to recognize light. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. I think I am only beginning to understand what you mean. She laughed softly. Then maybe both of us are still learning. As we continued down the sidewalk, I realized something that would have terrified the man I used to be. I was no longer trying to change Grace. Without ever asking for it, she had already begun changing me. The change inside me became impossible to hide. It appeared in small decisions that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but felt enormous to the man I had been. I started leaving meetings early instead of extending them simply to prove I controlled the room. I listened before speaking. I thanked people whose work I had once taken for granted. Anthony watched all of it with quiet curiosity until one evening, he finally asked the question I had been avoiding myself. Who are you becoming, Vincent? I looked out across the city lights from the back seat of the SUV before answering. I do not know yet. It was the first honest answer I had given anyone in years. The following afternoon, I arrived at the Community Arts Center carrying nothing except 2 cups of coffee from the small cafe across the street. Grace laughed as soon as she accepted one. You remembered I always order cinnamon instead of sugar. I smiled. I pay attention now. She held the warm cup between both hands. That is rare. We sat together on a weathered wooden bench in the courtyard while children practiced songs drifting through the open windows. The breeze carried laughter, piano notes, and the scent of freshly cut grass. For several peaceful minutes, neither of us felt the need to fill the silence. Then Grace asked a question that settled heavily against my heart. Vincent, what do you really do? I had prepared for difficult negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yet I had never prepared for that simple question. I searched for an answer that was honest without destroying everything we had built. I spend most of my time solving problems, I finally said. She smiled gently. That sounds exhausting. Sometimes it is. She nodded as though she understood more than I had admitted. People who spend their lives solving everyone else's problems often forget they have hearts of their own. Her words lingered between us long after she spoke them. Before I could respond, the center director hurried into the courtyard carrying a folder filled with estimates from roofing contractors. His expression was apologetic. Grace, I hate to interrupt, but 2 companies raised their prices again. We are farther from our goal than ever. Grace accepted the papers calmly and thanked him. She never complained. She simply began thinking of another way forward. Watching her quietly shoulder burdens that should never have belonged to one person made something inside me shift completely. That evening, I returned to my office and called the chairman of the charitable foundation that quietly handled many of my anonymous donations. I want to establish a community matching grant, I told him. Every dollar the neighborhood raises will be matched 3-to-1. The foundation receives full credit. My name stays out of it. There was a long silence before he answered. Are you certain? Yes. Why remain anonymous? I looked through the window toward the distant neighborhood where Grace was probably finishing another piano lesson. Because this is not about making people grateful to me. The chairman laughed softly. That does not sound like the Vincent Moretti I know. Perhaps that man is becoming someone else. Within days, volunteers doubled. Local businesses donated supplies. Contractors reduced labor costs after hearing about the matching program. Parents organized concerts. Students held bake sales. The neighborhood transformed hope into action because they believed they were saving their own community together. Grace thanked every volunteer personally, never realizing that I had quietly removed the obstacle standing in front of them instead of placing myself at the center of the story. As I watched children carrying paintbrushes into the building one Saturday morning, I finally understood the difference between power and purpose. Power demanded to be seen. Purpose quietly changed lives, even when no one knew your name. Several months passed before I fully understood what had happened to me. The Community Arts Center stood brighter than it had the day I first walked through its doors. The repaired roof no longer leaked during storms. Fresh paint reflected afternoon sunlight across the hallways. New music books filled the shelves beside the old ones that Grace had refused to throw away because, as she liked to say, every page still had something to teach. I visited often, always quietly, never announcing my arrival. The neighborhood still believed the charitable foundation had transformed the building. I preferred it that way. One crisp autumn afternoon, the center celebrated its reopening with a small concert. Families filled every chair. Children laughed backstage while practicing the songs Grace had patiently taught them. I stood near the back of the room where no one paid much attention to me. Anthony remained several steps away, smiling more openly than I had ever seen. "You were right," he whispered. I looked toward the stage. "About what?" "You said you would be the one learning the lesson." I smiled without taking my eyes off Grace. I underestimated my teacher. The lights dimmed as the children began to play. Their music was not perfect. A few notes arrived too early. Others arrived too late. Yet the audience applauded with tears in their eyes because perfection had never been the point. Hope was. When the final song ended, Grace thanked every volunteer by name. She thanked the parents, the teachers, the local businesses, and every child who believed the center deserved another chance. She never mentioned herself. She never mentioned the anonymous donor. She believed the community had saved itself together, and perhaps she was right. After everyone left, we stood alone outside beneath a sky filled with early evening stars. Cool air carried the scent of fallen leaves across the quiet street. Grace folded her white cane and smiled toward my voice. "Vincent, I am here." She laughed softly. "I knew you would be." We stood together without speaking for a long moment before she asked, "Can I tell you something strange?" "Always. The first day we met, I thought you carried the weight of the whole world." I lowered my eyes. "Maybe I did." She nodded gently. "Now your footsteps sound lighter." I could not explain how deeply those words reached me. Every expensive watch I had ever owned, every contract I had signed, every building that carried my influence. None of them had ever made me feel as wealthy as that simple sentence. I finally took a slow breath. "Grace, there is something I should have told you a long time ago." She listened quietly. "The day we met, I was angry. I believed you had humiliated me." She smiled with amused surprise. "I imagined that much. At first I wanted to teach you a lesson." She laughed so warmly that I found myself laughing with her. "And how did that plan work out?" I looked toward the glowing windows of the center where children's voices still echoed faintly inside. "Not very well." She reached out until her hand found my sleeve. "No, Vincent." Her smile became even gentler. "I think it worked perfectly." I realized she was right. The woman who had never seen my face had seen my heart more clearly than anyone ever had. She had not changed me with fear, demands, or promises. She had changed me by living with quiet courage every single day. As we walked slowly beneath the autumn sky, I finally understood the truth that had been waiting since the rain-soaked afternoon when our lives collided by accident. The slap never wounded my pride. It shattered the walls around my heart. And the greatest revenge anyone ever took on me was teaching me that the strongest man in the room is not the one everyone fears. It is the one who finally learns how to become worthy of another person's trust.